Judging France 24, welcome along to Eye on Africa, our daily look across the continent. The headlines. Fighting continues in Sudan despite warring factions agreeing to extend a truce. Gunfire and explosions are heard in Khartoum as the United Nations warns the conflict is reigniting ethnic clashes in the western Darfur region. High hopes against the fight against malaria in Kenya. Over 10,000 people die from the disease each year. But the prevalence rate is on a steady downward trend, and a new vaccine looks set to be approved soon. And we take you to Ivory Coast for the FEMUA music festival that's taking place this week. Renowned musicians from across the world coming together in Abidjan for one of West Africa's biggest Afropop events. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm James Mulholland. We begin in Sudan, where fighting continues despite the warring factions agreeing to renew a 3-day ceasefire. Heavy gunfire and explosions were reported in the capital Khartoum and its twin city Omdurman, and the United Nations has warned that the conflict was reigniting ethnic clashes in the western Darfur region. Dozens of countries began to evacuate their citizens under the last ceasefire, and waves of Sudanese people are also desperate to escape. Those unable to are suffering severe shortages of basic goods, water and electricity. Selena Sykes tells us more.
While the rush to evacuate foreign nationals continues, locals left behind in Khartoum face an increasingly dire situation. 2 weeks of fighting have left the Sudanese capital in shortage of basic supplies.
There's no water, no power, no essentials for people to use. Even this elderly woman who is ill can't find her medicine.
The local petrol station is deserted, while this bakery has shut its doors. People are scrambling for the few food items left, as supermarket shelves are nearly empty.
There'll be nothing left in 4 or 5 days. We're trying to still go out and get fruits and vegetables, but we're out of grains, canned food, flour and sugar.
Diminishing supplies in a country where a third of the 46 million population was already dependent on humanitarian aid before fighting broke out. Many Sudanese citizens are taking any bus they can out of Khartoum. Ticket prices have soared from $60 to over $340. Tens of thousands have fled to neighbouring countries, including Chad, which has welcomed around 20,000 people so far, according to the United Nations.
The population here has problems in accessing drinkable water. So with a huge number of refugees coming in, it's going to be the main issue urgently before those people can even settle further away from the border.
The number of arrivals in Chad is expected to rise to 100,000, a wave of refugees that is prompting concern amid aid workers about their capacity to provide help for everyone.
Next, a victory for Senegalese riflemen who served with the French army 6 decades ago. 9 of the so-called Senegalese tirailleurs, the oldest 96 years old, have been allowed to return home with their full military pension. Until recently, they were only eligible if they spent 6 months per year in France. Our correspondent Sam Bradpeace met one of them as he touched down in Dakar.
The 9 Senegalese soldiers who touched down in Dakar today are all in their 80s and 90s. All of them have been battling for years for the right to collect their military pensions while living full-time in Senegal. And that day has finally come, much to their delight.
That's wonderful. I'm very happy to see my family, very happy to see my children. At one point I did not see my children for a year. And when I come back, I'm always happy.
Hundreds of thousands of African soldiers fought for the French army during the 2 world wars and in later Cold War era conflicts. Many of those still alive are simply no longer in fit condition to return to their home countries.
Sam Bradpeace in Dakar there. Next, in Tunisia, the city of Sfax is struggling to cope with the rising number of migrants attempting the dangerous sea crossing to Europe. A string of deadly shipwrecks in recent days has seen over 200 migrants drown in the area, and morgues and hospitals in Sfax can't keep up. Laurent Berstiger has the story.
Sitting less than 200 kilometers away from the Italian coast, the Tunisian port city of Sfax has become one of the main departure points for migrants trying to reach Europe. But a recent series of deadly shipwrecks in the Mediterranean have left the local morgue unable to cope.
The numbers exceed our capacity. On Tuesday, the morgue received almost 200 bodies, but the hospital's capacity is only 40 or 50.
In order to relieve pressure on hospitals, local authorities have begun to hold daily burials after taking DNA swaps in case families come forward. In the Sfax cemetery, rows of unadorned tombstones display the numbers given to the bodies that couldn't be identified. Here, too, space is beginning to run out, despite the city's best efforts.
We don't have a designated cemetery for such cases, but thanks to the combined efforts of the city of Sfax and the surrounding municipalities, we have been able to increase the number of burials.
Migrant departures from Tunisia have been on the rise following a series of aggressive speeches by President Kais Saied. The city of Sfax says it's taken in over 200 dead bodies in the past 10 days.
Next to Kenya, where 3.5 million people contract malaria each year. 10,700 die from it. But the country is one of Africa's leading examples in the fight against the disease. The prevalence rate is constantly decreasing, with 8% of the population affected in 2015 compared to 6% in 2020. That progress is thanks largely to the RTS vaccine, and now the World Health Organization has announced another imminent vaccine, as Nick Spicer and Fred Ooko report.
In this clinic in Kisumu, doctors treat malaria patients. Across Kenya, some 3.5 million people contract the disease every year.
Malaria has become a big problem in our family. I tested positive and was sick all last week. I pray that researchers find a solution because we are losing many children.
Between 2019 and 21, Kenya tested an anti-malarial vaccine. Today, more than 1 million doses have been administered to children under 5 in endemic regions in the west of the country.
The child must continue to sleep under a treated mosquito net. Being vaccinated does not mean that we cannot contract malaria, it just reduces the risks.
The most recent studies show infection rates dropping sharply from 27 to 19% between 2015 and 2020. In March, the Health Ministry announced it was expanding its vaccination drive.
There is a very big change since we started giving RTSS to under children from 6 months. The severity has been reduced, and also mortality to under 5 children has also been reduced.
At least 28 African countries plan to deploy the vaccine in the future. A second vaccine still in the study phase could soon also be approved by the World Health Organization.
Having an additional tool to add to existing ones to fight malaria is just something that everyone is looking forward to. WHO is closely working with the developers of that vaccine to gather critical data.
Preliminary studies show that the R21 vaccine is 75% effective. Tests conducted in Kenya have not yet been published, but in Ghana, authorities have just approved its use for children from 5 to 36 months of age.
A US court has ordered the man behind a South African Ponzi scheme to pay $3.4 billion for what authorities say is the largest ever fraud case involving Bitcoin. The firm, Mirror Trading International, misappropriated some $1.7 billion in the cryptocurrency between 2018 and 2021. And as our correspondent in Cape Town, Nadine Theron, tells us, the victims are unlikely to get back any of their Bitcoin.
South African victims of Mirror Trading International fear they might lose all of the 4.6 billion rand they invested in the scam. The American Commodity Futures Trading Commission says MTI is the largest fraudulent scheme involving Bitcoin it's ever dealt with, and its CEO has been ordered to pay the highest civil monetary penalty ever ordered by the Commission. On Thursday, the Western District Courts of Texas ordered CEO Johann Steinberg to pay $1.7 billion in restitution to around 23,000 defrauded victims in the USA, as well as a penalty of the same amount. Steinberg is being detained in Brazil and is currently fighting his extradition. This after a warrant for his arrest was issued by Interpol and the FBI. He and 17 other masterminds misappropriated almost all of the Bitcoin they accepted from investors and claimed to be investing it in a pool of commodities. But this week, the South African High Court ruled that there was never any pool of investors' Bitcoin, and instead, MTI used later investors' funds to pay so-called returns to early investors, a classic pyramid scheme. Because the American court recognizes the South African liquidation process, victims are unlikely to ever see any of their losses recovered. The company's recovered assets only amount to around 1.5 billion rand in Bitcoin, and the liquidator's bill is already only slightly less than that.
Finally, to Ivory Coast, where the 15th edition of the FEMUA Music Festival is taking place in Abidjan. It's one of West Africa's biggest Afropop events and brings in renowned musicians from across the world. Sophie Lamotte, our correspondent in Ivory Coast, was lucky enough to go along.
It's a festive atmosphere here in Abidjan for the 15th edition of the FEMUA, the Urban Music Festival. It's one of the biggest music festivals in Africa. Roughly 200,000 people are expected to attend this week, and there's a general sense of excitement for the star-studded lineup of performers, including the Senegalese singer Baba Mal and the French rapper Booba. Togolese music and tradition is especially celebrated this year as the country is the guest of honor. Take a listen at one of their headliners, Santinos Raphael.
It's a pleasure for me to represent Togo at FEMUA, which is one of the biggest festivals we have in Africa, not to say the biggest in French-speaking Africa. Togo's independence anniversary also takes place this week, so we can celebrate it at FEMUA. We also have a large diaspora in Ivory Coast, so this is an opportunity for us to thank them for the warm welcome they gave the Togolese.
Beyond a central cultural hotspot on the continent, the FEMUA also carries some social and cultural aspects. This year, the theme will focus on food security and sustainable agriculture. Asalfo, leader of the famous Ivorian group Magic System and the founder of this festival, tells us more.
We've had two crises, COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, that showed how limited Africa was. We saw inflation in different countries and understood that Africa wasn't as self-reliant in terms of food security as we thought. So it was important for us to reach out to the youths.
The festival is free and open to all since its inauguration in 2008, and in addition to concerts, it also welcomes sporting events, panel discussions and workshops to promote youth entrepreneurship.
The FEMUA Festival wrapping up on Sunday in Abidjan. And that's it for this edition of Eye on Africa. Coming up in just a few moments, it's the international headlines. Stay with us here on France 24.
The history of our world is ever-changing. The flow of information is constantly increasing. We cover all subjects. We verify. We commit. On the ground, in all circumstances, to anticipate the future by understanding the present. We are with you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. France 24, an alternative look at the news.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.